Welcome back to the deep dive. Now, the sources you sent us this week were they were really fascinating.
Weren't they? A total shift in perspective on a few things.
Yeah, a huge shift.
Yeah.
They fundamentally challenge how we view, well, two massive concepts, prophecy and national recovery.
It's a seismic shift, really. We tend to think of a prophet as, a kind of divine radio just receiving and delivering a message.
Just a passive conduit.
Exactly. But these sources argue they were much more instrumental. They use this stunning term,
Which is?
creative historians.
Creative historians. That
Yeah.
sounds, well, it sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? Historians look backward.
Right, and that's the whole point. A normal historian, they analyze the past. They diagnose why something happened.
Okay.
But a creative historian, they start there, they diagnose the present moment, and then they use that analysis to actively steer the future.
So they aren't just commenting on history,
Mm.
they're trying to create it.
They're dictating the direction the community has to take. They're essentially the living conscience of history, demanding a response.
But let me push back on that for a second. Doesn't calling them creative historians sort of diminish the divine aspect? Is the source just saying they were really, really smart political strategists?
Not at all. In fact, it argues this is precisely how they prove God is active.
How so?
The core claim is that their ability to read the moment and then set a course that actually comes to pass, well, that's the evidence that God is alive and involved in human history.
So it's not like the Greek gods who are just sort of
Yeah,
out there disinterested.
exactly. The prophet's success is the proof of intervention. It makes the stakes incredibly high.
It really does. It moves prophecy from abstract theology right into tangible political history.
Which brings us to the ultimate proof point for this idea, the prophet Jeremiah.
Right before the Babylonian exile.
Yes. And he's critical because he completely reframed the disaster. Everyone saw the exile as the end. Banishment.
Here you go.
Punishment.
Total fail.
But Jeremiah redefined it. He framed it as a strategic mission, a temporary, calculated move that would ultimately lead to Babylon's own downfall and, crucially, secure their return.
And the absolute, undeniable proof that he was right.
The Cyrus Decree.
We'll talk about that. Cyrus, the founder of the Persian Empire, conquers Babylon.
And in 538 BC, he does something that provides the physical proof that the creative historians had been right all along.
So what was it about this decree that was so unprecedented?
Well, for one, it wasn't standard policy for an empire, and he does it in his very first year. But what's truly astonishing, and the sources really emphasize this,
Yeah.
is that of all the peoples Babylon had captured and deported, and there were many,
So many different groups.
it was only the Judeans who were given this unique sanctioned right to return and rebuild. The source calls it a unique event in human history.
I can't even imagine what that must have felt like for them. Decades in exile, and then suddenly this.
It was almost literally unbelievable. You can feel the shock and the joy in their writings. Psalm 126 captures it perfectly.
What does it say?
When the Lord brought back the captives to Zion, we were like those who dreamed.
We were like people dream. Wow.
It just underscored that this wasn't some random political act by Cyrus. It was the end point of a historical trajectory that the prophets had laid out decades before.
Okay, so if the prophet's whole deal was connecting faith to what's happening in the real world, what does that mean for people who teach these texts today? Because the sources have some pretty harsh words on that front.
They really do. It's a crucial pivot. The argument is that if you fail to apply the scripture to the current historical reality, if you can't read the sign of the times,
You become what?
you become a blind guide, the spiritual equivalent of the scribes and Pharisees that Jesus called out.
Blind because they're stuck in the past.
They're stuck in one of two places.
Yeah.
Either reciting history, quoting what Calvin or Augustine said centuries ago as if that's the final word, or they're focused only on the afterlife, on heaven.
So they ignore the here and now.
Completely. They teach about history or the future, but they offer no guidance for the present. And that reminds me of that famous analogy.
New wine must go into new wineskins.
Exactly. A new age, a new historical situation, it demands a fresh interpretation. You can't force it into old, brittle structures. It just doesn't work.
So clinging to these centuries-old interpretations is essentially holding the community back.
Precisely. You become a museum keeper, not a guide. And you can see this exact principle at work with the returnees themselves.
Okay, yeah.
Their very first task when they got back was to rebuild the temple.
Which seems counterintuitive, right? I mean, didn't the earlier prophets spend centuries condemning the first temple as a place of corruption?
That's a great point. It would seem like a huge step backward.
So why do it?
Because, and this is the vital distinction the source makes, they were building a temple in name only. The whole concept was different.
How was it different?
Well, think about the old temple. Before the exile, it was all about bloody sacrifice, ritual, and commerce. A lot of commerce.
A den of robbers, as Jeremiah put it.
And that wasn't just a metaphor. The source talks about temple profiteers charging like 30 times the market price for a sacrificial dove. It was an exploitative machine.
So a morally bankrupt system.
Entirely. But the new temple, the second temple, its function was totally transformed by their experience in exile.
In Babylon.
Right. In Babylon, they developed the synagogue, which was all about studying the law, about instruction. So the second temple's main function became that. It was a center for instruction and study, not just ceremony. The word became more important than the ritual.
So they re-engineered it spiritually. But that first wave of about 50,000 people returns, and that initial excitement must have crashed headfirst into a pretty brutal reality.
Oh, it evaporated almost immediately. The physical and economic reality was just crushing.
To the point that even with the temple as their top priority, construction just stopped.
It stopped for over a decade, more than
Wow.
10 years.
Why? What happened?
Two things, really. First, just sheer physical exhaustion. They were a small group with limited resources trying to do this massive civil engineering project. They ran out of steam.
And the second thing?
Demoralization. A huge psychological blow. They just come from Babylon with its massive gold-plated temples, and they look at their own small, rough stone and earth project, and it just felt
Inadequate.
pathetic even. They lost all their enthusiasm.
And on top of that, they were facing an economic dead end. Jerusalem was a ruin. How do you even feed 50,000 people?
You can't. Not with the old ways. Farming, raising livestock. The land around the city was basically wilderness after decades of neglect. They couldn't survive.
So if the land can't support them, what's the only other option?
International trade. It was their only path to survival. But trade in the ancient world requires credit. It requires trust.
And this is way before modern banking or insurance policies or anything like that.
Centuries before. So how do you guarantee a long-term deal? How do you establish that trust?
And this is where we get to that truly shocking detail from the sources, the collateral they had to put up.
Yes. They needed something absolutely ironclad to guarantee these deals. Land wasn't secure enough, so they used their own children as collateral.
It's just brutal to even think about.
They married their sons and daughters to their trading partners. It created a strategic alliance where failure to deliver on the deal had, well, life or death consequences for your own child.
A literal mortgaging of the next generation for survival today.
It just shows the absolute desperation they were in. And even if the trading worked, they had another huge problem.
Security.
Exactly. You can't keep what you earn if people can just raid you and take it all. They were constantly being plundered.
So they needed a wall, a defensive city wall.
Urgently. Not just for defense, but to create a secure economic hub. But again, they didn't have the manpower or the resources. So for decades, the walls stayed down.
Which brings us to Nehemiah. He's the key figure here. But he wasn't even in Jerusalem at first?
No, he was back in Mesopotamia in the Persian court. And he wasn't some minor official. He was high-ranking, a personal attendant to the king, maybe a cupbearer, someone with a deep personal trust.
This is about 90 years after that first return, around 445 BC.
Right. And the moment Nehemiah hears about how his people are suffering, the starvation, the city being exposed, he's just completely broken by it.
The source says he couldn't eat or sleep for a month.
He became visibly emaciated. And then he takes this enormous, calculated risk.
By going into the king's presence looking so distraught.
Which was, we have to understand, a potential capital offense. You did not upset the king's mood. You didn't do it.
So he was gambling with his life.
He was gambling his life on the years of trust he had built with the king. It was an all-or-nothing move.
And when the king asks him why he's so sorrowful, what's his pitch?
It was masterful. He explains the situation. His city is in ruins. His people are starving. But he doesn't just appeal to pity. He appeals to Persian imperial policy. He essentially reminds the king that letting Judea fail goes against the foundational legacy of the empire itself, the policy of Cyrus the Great. He links his people's survival to the king's own legacy.
That is brilliant. And the king's reaction says everything about why he trusted Nehemiah so much.
Absolutely. The king sees this profound sacrificial dedication and must have thought, this is a true leader. He grants the request. Nehemiah asks to be sent as governor to rebuild Judea, to make it an independent province free from the hostile neighbors who were blocking everything.
He traded his comfortable, powerful position as the king's top advisor for a dangerous job in a ruined territory.
A massive sacrifice. The king clearly didn't want him to go, asking him to come back as soon as he could. Nehemiah basically traded all of his political capital for the life and security of his people.
Which brings our deep dive to a close. We went from this high-level idea of the creative historian all the way down to the grit and pain of rebuilding a nation, the economics, the security, and finally this incredible act of leadership from Nehemiah.
And getting the king's permission was just the first step. The sources make it clear that building that wall was incredibly difficult. He had opposition at every turn. He had to have a plan that solved the security crisis and the economic crisis at the same time.
He had to be a manager, a strategist, a leader, all at once.
He did. And that leaves us with a final thought for you to take away from all this. Nehemiah wasn't a priest. He wasn't a prophet in the traditional sense. He was a high-level administrator. We know he faced intense, relentless opposition. So the question is, what specific, practical, maybe even ruthless methods did this unique manager-leader have to use to overcome that opposition and actually get the wall built against all odds? That's the next chapter.